give the floor to our Vice-rector, László to have his opening speech. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor BÉKÉS. It's a great honor, dear professors, dear colleagues, dear students. On behalf of the Corvinus University of Budapest, it is my honor to welcome all of the participants on the occasion of the 11th Annual Cold War International Student Conference, which is jointly organized by the Institute of International Political and Regional Studies at the Corvinus University of Budapest, as well as the Center for Social Sciences Budapest and the European Institute Columbia University, New York. A very warm welcome to Victoria Phillips, who is an old friend of us, and Mark Cramer, who is going to be the keynote speaker quite soon. It has become now a tradition to organize the annual international event on the new research findings of the Cold War. And despite of the pandemic, it's very important to hold this conference online. And we do very much hope that the next year we're going to have an on-site conference. Well, to borrow the paraphrase of John Lewis Gaddis, we now know the Cold War, I have to say, still offers plenty of historical evidence and experience for further research and analysis. I would like to give you a few words about our university, as we have a number of international participants here. Corvinus University has just recently launched a renewal strategy of the university, which mainly focuses on further internationalization project. The aim of the university is to become an internationally recognized institute of higher education globally and, of course, in the region as well. We have the intention to strengthen our Central European identity, and for this reason, we just going to establish a network of universities, a Central European network of universities, the so-called CENU, the Central European Network of Universities, which is going to serve as a hub for the universities to organize jointly events, international conferences, and education programs, double degrees, hopefully. So this is one of the very important strategy of the university. Beside this, we're trying to renew our education portfolio as well to somehow respond to the challenges of the 21st century and to focus more on issues like digitalization or Industry 4.0 or sustainability issues. But among this, of course, the Cold War is a very important issue. Especially, we have an Institute of International Political and Regional Studies, in which education on the Cold War and research on the Cold War issues is very important. We attract a number of students from all over the world, I have to say, in the center, as it was said by Professor Csaba BÉKÉS. It's not only the annual international conference, but also we have a professional training for international students to involve in different scientific activities, PhD students as well. So I have to say that we are very proud that this Cold War Center, Cold War History Research Center at the Corvinus University of Budapest serves as a kind of international network for research on the Cold War issues. So with these words, I would like to wish you a successful two-day conference, and I hope that the next year we can have an on-site event at the Corvinus University of Budapest. I really appreciate all of the efforts and the contribution of Professor Csaba BÉKÉS and his staff, because without them, it would be not possible to listen to the following presentations on the Cold War. So thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to listening the keynote speech soon. Thank you, Csaba, and I give the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Csicman, for the opening speech. And with this, let me give the floor to our keynote speaker, Mark Cramer, whom I have already introduced briefly in my opening remarks. However, of course, I didn't mention something which is quite well known, but just for the record, we have to also emphasize this here as well, that he is one of the best known scholars of the Cold War in today's world. So he is not just a big name because he is from Harvard University, but because his own activity, several decades of hard work and publications activity, and he is also the person who doesn't spare time and energy to travel to conferences all over the world, including Eastern Europe, including the former Soviet Union's territory. So he is really a very unique member of the so-called Cold War, new Cold War history school. So with that, let me give the floor to Mark Cramer. And Mark, please have your keynote speech right now.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much, Csaba, and my warm thanks to you for inviting me to give today's keynote speech. I hope that everyone can hear me. I also am looking for the PowerPoint presentation that I shared. I hope, yeah, right. So let me go to that if I could. Can you see this okay?
Yes.
Okay. So let me then use this in part because I realize that most of the participants are not native English speakers, and I will be a little easier if I present it with PowerPoint. I can do it without, but PowerPoint can sometimes be a little off-putting. But still, I figured that it'll be more useful to do it this way. I very much welcome the opening comments as well, and share the hope that next year maybe we can have in-person events, maybe even later this year, possibly either in the United States or in Hungary or elsewhere. But I enjoyed learning more about Corvinus University, which I have been to before a couple of times, but had not known as much about. So I'm glad to learn that. So today I'm going to be, let me start just by being very clear about what I mean by the Cold War, because that sometimes is just taken for granted. So let me briefly start with that, and then I will get into the study of the Cold War. The Cold War was roughly a 45-year period. You can argue about the start dates. It's less arguable about the end of it, but it's certainly the 1989 to 91 period, I think most people would agree on. But but still, it coincided with the advent of the nuclear age, and the two phenomena are intertwined. It is sometimes hard to separate them. They are separable, but they are closely linked, and it would be very difficult to understand the Cold War without understanding that nuclear weapons were present, and from 1949 on, they were possessed both by the United States and by the Soviet Union, and then later by other countries. So lasting from roughly the mid-1940s through the end of the 1980s, the Cold War had three underlying features. I'll just touch on these very briefly. Two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, were seen as vastly stronger than other countries, which is why they were characterized as superpowers, or sometimes the two poles in a fundamentally bipolar world. I'll be coming back to that at several points in the talk about the extent of bipolarity and the relevance of it to discussion. Second, there was a deep-rooted ideological divide between the two superpowers, essentially competing conceptions about how to organize societies, hitting Marxism-Leninism in the Soviet Union against liberal capitalist democracy in the United States. It's not to say that the United States started out as a liberal capitalist democracy, because at the time the Cold War began, the United States still had institutionalized segregation. And that didn't end until the mid-1960s. So you can argue about the extent to which it lived up to those ideals, but those were certainly the ideals professed going back a long while in American history. Third would be that large parts of the world, above all Europe and much of Asia, were divided into two rival camps led by the superpowers. Outside Europe and Asia, it was partly because decolonization had not begun at the time, or was just beginning at the time that the Cold War was setting in. But certainly in Europe, with the stark divide between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, few neutral countries were thrown in, but most of Europe was starkly divided, as represented by opposing military forces. And much the same happened soon after with Asia. A lot of that was brought about by the Korean War, as I'll be discussing, but still the divide was quite clear throughout the Cold War. And this bifurcation sparked, or at least fueled, destructive wars in East Asia, Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, and Central America. It wasn't necessarily the cause of all of these wars, but it certainly greatly worsened. So even with the rise of other important actors, especially China under communist rule from 1949 on, what became the European community and the European Economic Community, and nowadays is the European Union, that really began with the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community in the early 1950s and evolved into the more integrated European structures that we know today. Japan as well, other actors too, including the non-aligned movement that emerged starting in the 1950s, but particularly the 1960s, and from then on. The international system nonetheless remained fundamentally bipolar during the Cold War, symbolized by the immense nuclear arsenals deployed by the two superpowers, numbering tens of thousands of weapons. It's really quite an astonishing situation if you look back on it, that the two sides built such immense numbers of nuclear weapons, numbering at their height around 32,000 in the United States in 1967 and around 46,000 in the Soviet Union in 1986. Why they would have needed so many nuclear weapons is a separate topic that perhaps we can come back to in the future. During the Cold War, historiography in the United States and other Western countries about the Cold War evolved from what John Gaddis described as traditionalism or orthodoxy to revisionism, to a so-called post-revisionist synthesis. These are Gaddis's terms. They are widely used, so I'm not trying to argue that they're confined to him, but still, these were terms that were at least given popularity in an article he wrote close to 40 years ago. And in the post-Cold War years, a much more intricate historiography, what Csaba referred to as the new Cold War history, has emerged not only in the West, but around the world. I think the term new Cold War history is appropriate, even though a lot of the historiography that emerged during the Cold War remains very useful. Not all of it, but quite a bit of it. And I think it's sometimes unfairly overlooked. The vastly greater availability of archival materials in all the participant countries in the post-Cold War era has greatly enriched the study of how the Cold War began in Europe and East Asia. The opportunities for scholars in the former Soviet bloc to write historical accounts without having to accommodate official strictures as they did during communist times have generated an immense body of valuable literature. The opportunities for scholars to make use of archival materials and to interview key figures, it's getting less possible to interview some of the key figures because they're dying off, but there's still, even now, more than 30 years later, still a lot who are alive. And in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, that all of those opportunities have greatly expanded the range of topics that can be explored in depth. So the Cold War era historiography did take ample account of conflicts and crises in developing countries. They weren't ignored, contrary to sometimes the way that literature is caricatured. But one major trend in post-Cold War historiography has been to focus more on the so-called global Cold War, something that I will be giving attention to, in particular, toward the end of my lecture today. But and that gives greater emphasis to the roles of smaller countries. Although some of this new scholarship unfairly caricatures Cold War era work, which often did an excellent job of covering global issues despite the scant resources, that is, archival resources that were available. They weren't available, so it was sometimes difficult, but there was still a great deal of coverage. Nonetheless, there's no question that the burgeoning scholarship over the past 30 years has fundamentally bolstered the quality of historiography about the Cold War. So some of the topics that have come up in recent literature would go back to issues that were explored during the Cold War, but have tried to do so in ways that make use of the new archival evidence and shed much greater light on them. Some of these are long-standing and very familiar themes, like the role of power, relative power, especially security, whether, for example, the Soviet Union was simply seeking security, as Wojciech Masny argued both during the Cold War and has argued since, whether both superpowers were seeking spheres of influence and to balance against each other. That argument has come up, for example, in a recent book by Norman Neymark, but it has also been discussed extensively elsewhere by Mark Trachtenberg. I'll come back to that in a short while. Also, the questions of ideology, identity, and culture. I'll again look briefly at each of these. The geographic scope as well has certainly encompassed the whole world, that even though, again, I would still argue the Cold War era historiography did look at much of the world as well. It's just become much more feasible nowadays to not only discuss Europe and East Asia, which Europe is where the Cold War began, soon spread to East Asia, but then also the effects the Cold War had in South Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So the global effects of the Cold War as compared to the notion of a global Cold War, which I'm uncomfortable with, I instead prefer to talk about the global effects of the Cold War, and I will be coming back to that shortly. International relations theory has also been invoked in some of the post-Cold War era historiography. I was trained in international relations theory, so I'm somewhat partial to this and have taught classes in it. But so some of the major strands of international relations theory have mostly been used implicitly, but sometimes very explicitly, as say the work of Mark Trachtenberg, for example, or numerous other scholars, Matthew Evangelista, others who have contributed to the post-Cold War era historiography have sometimes used it explicitly, but it often is used implicitly. Some even terms that have evolve to refer to particular approaches used by different powers are very much rooted in international relations theory, even if they don't explicitly refer to it. Cold War era scholarship produced during the Cold War. Let me just very quickly touch on this as a starting point. There was the orthodoxy that or traditionalism. Am I okay here? Well, in any event, there were memoirs and early studies. It was actually quite a diverse body. I'm not sure there was ever truly am I coming through here? I'm hearing some sort of noise. Well, in any event, but still, this was where a lot of the original historiography lay in works like that of Walter Lippmann. William Appleman Williams started the trend toward revisionism that then moved through others who reflected a similar outlook. Marshall Schulman wrote about Stalin's foreign policy, but also really operating in the same vein. It moved in a more radical direction as the Vietnam War took root in the, or the US role in the Vietnam War took root in the mid-1960s and escalated in the mid-1960s after really first sharply escalating during the Kennedy administration. And then as the several 100,000 US troops were eventually deployed in Vietnam, that had a very direct influence on the revisionist historiography. It's not true only about that era. If you look at, for example, about the impact of the 2003 Iraq War on the post-Cold War era historiography, you will find similar tendencies that disaffection with foreign wars can sometimes influence historiography, even though in principle it shouldn't. It can sharpen, though, the way the past is viewed. And this eventually led to the rise of a much more radical revisionism with Gabriel Coca, I cite as just one of them, but there are numerous others where Coca was a Marxist who wrote numerous books about the Cold War. Post-revisionism, with which Gaddis, I think, I still find these his two most illuminating books, more so than anything I think he has produced in the post-Cold War era. But the first, the United States and the Origins of the Cold War, which was the first, what I would describe as the first clear post-revisionist work that sought to make use of revisionist insights, but without subscribing to the pattern or the sort of orientation of the revisionist works. And then Strategies of Containment, which is probably his best known book. And others I've listed here. These are just examples. I could have listed many others. So the post-revisionist historiography really began in the 1970s and then burgeoned in the 1980s. It covered many topics, and I'm not going to get into this because I mostly want to focus on the post-Cold War era. So post-Cold War trends, one issue that has clearly emerged is the formation of different institutes. One of these existed in the pre-1989 era. That was the National Security Archive that got started in the mid-1980s in the United States. But most of these are purely products of the post-Cold War era, and deliberately so, because they wouldn't have been feasible to set up at a time when archival sources in the former Soviet bloc and in many other countries, including the West, where the end of the Cold War really accelerated declassification. So the Cold War International History Project, which the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., first began setting up in 1991, and then it had its major takeoff in 1992 under the founding director, Jim Hirschberg, who was instrumental in making the Cold War International History Project into the success it became, a great success. To this day, it's been under the leadership of Christian Osterman over the last 20 odd years, but the 20 I think 2 years, but and has remained a highly successful project. It put out for many years a Cold War International History Bulletin that was widely used and influential on the historiography. It included translations of former, particularly documents from the former Eastern Bloc, but there were other publications, working papers put out. Both Csaba and I put out working papers with the Cold War International History Project and published articles in the bulletin. So there was a great deal that went on and continues in somewhat different form to this day. The CWIHP remains a very active organization. National Security Archive is a private NGO. I emphasize that because it has a name similar to that of the National Security Agency, a U.S. intelligence agency. It's no connection at all. The National Security Archive was set up to press for the declassification of U.S. documents, has done invaluable work in that regard. That remains its primary function, but it is also expanded to cover the Cold War more generally. And so there is an active segment of the National Security Archive that also seeks documents from foreign countries. But the primary work of the National Security Archive is still focused on seeking the declassification of U.S. documents, and it has been instrumental in securing the release of key collections for the last close now to 40 years, but particularly in the post-Cold War world. Cold War Studies at Harvard University was set up in the, it began in the mid-1990s, the discussion, several people at Harvard about the idea of building on what the Cold War International History Project was doing, not to duplicate it, but to make use of the materials that were emerging to promote scholarship, especially to promote publications that would encourage scholars to make use of the vast amount of material that was emerging. Millions and millions of pages were emerging, and there was concern that so much of it would be accumulated that scholars would have to take decades to go through it. And of course, that has always been the case with archival sources, but particularly when suddenly floods of material were emerging. So that was the provenance of the Cold War Studies at Harvard that has sponsored the Journal of Cold War Studies, the Harvard Cold War Studies book series that have continued to this day. So that was, I think, the first of the university-based programs, at least the first that I know of. There was the establishment of similar programs soon after at other U.S. and foreign universities. So there are now numerous such programs in the United States and certainly abroad as well. And those are, again, carefully designed to make use of the resources that large research universities have, and that and the scholars who are present there, and to encourage other scholars to produce scholarship of the Cold War. So publications devoted to Cold War studies, I've mentioned the Cold War International History Project Bulletin and the Journal of Cold War Studies. There are others that were, one existed well before, Diplomatic History, which has focused a good deal of its attention on the Cold War. It's not the only topic it covers, but that's a product of the Society for the History of American Foreign Relations. But it's a broader journal than simply that title implies. It published a good deal of first-rate scholarship on other dimensions of the Cold War as well, not just about U.S. foreign policy. In Cold War history, which based at the London School of Economics in Britain, and that has also, over the last 20 years, 21 years maybe, has also been operating to encourage scholars to publish the best work they can do on the history of the Cold War. And there are numerous other history and social science journals that have also encouraged new work on the history of the Cold War. The excellent journal also edited at Harvard, International Security, the Journal of Strategic Studies, the Journal of Contemporary History, Journal of Modern History, all have, and many others have published first-rate work on the history of the Cold War. There's no shortage of work appearing. At the Journal of Cold War Studies, we receive somewhere between 350 and 400 manuscripts a year. So there's no shortage of scholarship coming out, and I very much welcome it. The Cold War Studies book series, there have been several of these. Harvard has one, the University of North Carolina has one, LSE has one, and numerous other universities as well, both in the United States, but particularly outside, where there's several other excellent series. So books are emerging, as well as articles tend to be a faster way to get out scholarship, but both have been published. So again, let me emphasize some of the sea changes in the historiography. One is the publication of first-rate scholarship by Russian scholars. Again, I'm listing some of them here. It's not meant to slight others. I'm just listing some as examples. There are many others I could have listed, but in particular, starting with a conference that was held in Moscow in January 1993, organized by the Cold War International History Project. Some of the Russian scholars that immediately stood out for me were Vladimir Pechatnev and Leonid Kubyansky in particular, and both are still active. Kubyansky's fairly old now, but is still writing, and Pechatnev is still very active at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Natalia Yegorova, who's at the Institute of Universal History, is still deputy director there. Vlad Zubak, who is of Russian origin, still a Russian citizen, but also a US citizen now, and has lived for quite a long while in the United States. Now, over the last 15 years or so, has been based in London at the London School of, as a professor at the London School of Economics. Sergei Rodchenko, also of Russian origin and still a Russian citizen, but has been based in, was in the United, did his education in both the United States and Britain at the London School of Economics, and has taught for a few years in the United States, but since then has been based in Britain, currently at Cardiff University, and one of the, again, a younger scholar than the first few I list there, and has produced some excellent work, first-rate work. This included experts on the Cold War in the Balkans, where I am currently based, and so that too, there scholars such as Andrei Yademsky. I'm here in Sofia, Bulgaria, until mid-June. The publication of valuable studies by Russian scholars is really a sea change in Cold War historiography, because there was no such scholarship during the Cold War. The books and the articles that came out about the Cold War during the Soviet era, really until almost the very end, were not of use to academic historians, except as a reflection of how the Soviet regime wanted its own policies to be portrayed. So the opening of numerous archives in Moscow has made possible the emergence of this scholarship, the publication of extremely important collections of declassified documents. Tatiana Valakitina is one who has produced extremely important collections about the about Soviet policy in Eastern Europe. The Yakovlev Foundation put out a large series of volumes. The Ruspen Academic Publishing House, it's not the only one by any means, but it has been particularly voluminous in its coverage of the Cold War. the Russian Archival Service has put out some valuable collections of declassified documents. The Russian Foreign Ministry has as well. So there's an enormous amount of archival material emerging in Russia in published form, as well as the archives that are open. German language scholarship has also been greatly enriched in the post-Cold War era. Such scholars as Jochen Laufer, I could have mentioned many others. There is the institute or the federal commission that was set up to oversee the former Stasi archives, which does oversee the archives, but also has had an important research component to it, has produced some invaluable works. The Military Historical Institute in Potsdam, it's now has a slightly different name, but I still call it the MGF. The Institute for Contemporary History, the Center for Historical Research in Potsdam, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the foundation that was set up in the memory of Konrad Adenauer, but has some extremely important research being done there and has sponsored research as well. The Hamburg Institute for Social Research sponsored about 10 or 12 conferences on the history of the Cold War and put out important volumes from some of the papers presented at those conferences. Those are only in German, but for those who know German, they remain valuable resources. Other important German language scholarship has emerged at the Boltzmann Institute in Austria, at the Boltzmann Institute. Stefan Karner was the founding director. Peter Rugenthaler has headed the Cold War research component of the Boltzmann Institute and has been extremely active in promoting first-rate scholarship, has undertaken important work himself, and has also organized numerous projects there. Barbara Stelzel-Marx, who is the current director of the Institute, Rugenthaler is the deputy director, and so they have worked together on many projects dealing with the Cold War and are continuing to currently. That is, they have really been very energetic in promoting scholarship in Austria, Germany, and especially the former Soviet Union, and promoting the release of documents. Scholarship in other former Warsaw Pact countries, again, it's hard for me to overstate what a change this is from the Cold War era, is the Institute of Political Studies in Poland, the Institute of National Remembrance. I've listed here, again, some examples. They aren't meant in any way to downplay the role of others, and I just am listing them. They're scholars I've known for many years, but I could have listed a lot of others. I just didn't want to overwhelm people with names, but I'm just giving a sense of the scholars who have really done first-rate work on the history of especially of Poland's role in the Cold War. And the same is true about Czechoslovakia. In both the Czech Republic and Slovakia, scholars have emerged over the last 30 years who have shed a great deal of light on various events in Czechoslovak history during the Cold War. And again, I've given some examples here of ones I have known for many years. In Hungary, Csaba, BÉKÉS, and especially the formation of the Cold War Studies Center, I think, has been a seminal development in the historiography of the Cold War about Hungary, that has shed so much more light on Hungary's role, not only well-known events like the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which has been exhaustively documented by some, not only Csaba, but also by some of the other scholars I've listed here: Janusz Reiner, Charles Gotti, who has lived in the United States for many years, but and László Borhi, who splits his time between the United States and Hungary. But others. But Csaba in the Cold War Study Center have also looked at all other aspects of Hungary's role in the Cold War, and more generally at the international dimensions of the Cold War. In Romania, again, there are both scholars in the diaspora, but also scholars within Romania. It's, I would say, been somewhat less some of the scholars within Romania have been somewhat less salient on the international scene. Some of them partly because of knowledge of English from most of them is fairly limited. Those who do, however, know English well have certainly been able to shed a great deal of light on Romania's role in the Cold War and the whole history of Romania during the communist era. It's now much better understood than it was. In Bulgaria, Mitu Isusov, as I mentioned, he's long dead, but he produced some extremely useful works in the early 1990s, and then I've listed others who have contributed more recently to the Cold War era historiography. Again, mostly in Bulgarian, but increasingly they have also published in English. There is still works that are being translated in English. So for those who don't know Bulgarian, there'll soon be more scholarship available on it. So let me very quickly, because I'm running out of time here, is I want to end and leave time for questions. So I propose to speak for about another 15 minutes. And there has been the return of maybe 10 minutes. I'll try to limit it to 10, but it may go to 15. So there has been a return of some of the spheres of influence arguments. I've mentioned that toward the beginning in the recent book by Norman Neymark, but earlier by scholars such as Mark Trachtenberg and Jeffrey Roberts. Michael Cox and Caroline Kennedy Pipe laid this out very explicitly and at some length in an article they wrote about the Marshall Plan that then generated responses from various scholars. Mark Trachtenberg laid it out in a long article he published about US policy toward Eastern Europe. Mikhail Narinsky has laid it out from based on looking at Soviet foreign policy. He and Wojciech Masny has made similar arguments. There are also analyses of the competing ideologies that have appeared, quite a great number of these that Melvin Leffler put out one that I think is quite illuminating in a recent collection of essays he called, which I believe is called Protecting Democratic Capitalism. It surveys mostly the United States, but it also has some very good insights into Soviet foreign policy. He doesn't know Russian, but he has used very extensively resources made available by the Cold War International History Project and others. And he had earlier published a book that also tried to reassess the Cold War in looking at rival ideologies. The Korean War, there's been a huge outpouring of scholarship. Some of this looks at the Korean War generally, and this burgeoned in the 1990s. I've listed again some of the people who have contributed especially important work to that scholarship, but I could have listed others. China's role in the Cold War is one that, again, this is a major change in the post-Cold War historiography. Scholars such as the ones I've listed here, Chen Zhan, Zheng Jihua, all scholars either of Chinese origin or still like Zheng Jihua live in China, and some of them split their time between Western countries and China. Others who have contributed include Russian scholars like Evgeny Bazhanov and Alexander Mansurov. Important work on China's role in the Cold War as well as the Soviet role in the Cold War, and then overviews of the Cold War. Of the Korean War. So and then more generally on Chinese foreign policy under Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, this again, the Chinese Central Archives are not accessible. However, there were important collections of documents published in China. It's starting in the 1980s, collections of Mao's his papers and collections of the papers of other leaders, Zhou Enlai, and so forth. And you know, these again are official publications, and China is still a communist dictatorship, but still the publications have been extremely useful. And similarly, the Foreign Ministry Archive in Beijing was fairly accessible from around 2004 until 2013. And they were at Harvard, we have collections of many of the documents, important documents that were released at that time, as do other universities. But Shen Jihua in particular at East China Normal University in Shanghai has enormous collections that he has made available there. They are in Chinese, so I warn people that if you don't know Chinese, then it'll be difficult to use those. But still, there are some of the documents you can find that are in foreign languages. I know, for example, there are some in Hungarian that Shen Jihua has. He's had them translated into Chinese, but they were originally from Hungary. The examinations of Chinese foreign policy have looked at both internal and external linkages in Chinese foreign policy. And I've listed some of the scholars who have contributed to the very rich literature. Many of them of Chinese origin, others in Western countries who have contributed, but it's a very rich literature at this point. U.S.-China relations have also undergone new scrutiny in the post-Cold War era. It's really moved hugely beyond where this historiography was during the Cold War, even though some of the same questions still come up. For example, Sergei Rodchenko published an article around 5 or 6 years ago that looked at the question of whether China could have been kept from becoming communist after the mid-1940s. He argued that some sort of compromise between the Kuomintang and the communists might have been feasible. There were responses to that article that were not as confident as the article suggested, but still, some of the same questions are still being examined, but with much better sources available. Sino-Soviet relations, again, there have been both scholars of Chinese origin, foreign scholars, and certainly Russian scholars who have contributed to the rich historiography on these topics. There are still some topics that are quite difficult to examine, especially some of the aspects of the 1969 border clashes. There is a great deal of documentation available at the archive that's now called Rigani, and also at the Foreign Ministry Archive in Moscow. But details on, for example, nuclear planning or a lot of the military aspects are still inaccessible. I've tried, but they're still inaccessible. Similarly, in China, there have been some important materials released on 1969, but it remains a difficult topic to explore in great detail, even though there is a lot that allows much more to be said about it now than during the Cold War. Nuclear weapons in the Cold War have, again, there's been a large blossoming of scholarship on this, partly because the end of the Cold War really spurred declassification in the United States, less so in most of the other nuclear powers. But in some cases, there is a great deal more available. For example, on India's nuclear program, or even on Israel's nuclear program, most of those were released unofficially, officially in the case of India, but then others are entirely closed. For example, Pakistan's is very little new documentation that's emerged. Pakistan didn't officially build nuclear weapons until after the Cold War, but it had a very active nuclear program starting in the nuclear weapons program starting in the 1970s. But in particular, and there have been extremely important volumes of documents released in Moscow. 9 huge volumes of documents of the Soviet Union's early nuclear weapons program, and then many other documents available at the archives that are accessible, even though a great deal is still not accessible. There are many documents that allow much greater scrutiny of Soviet nuclear weapons policies. And I've listed here some of the scholars who have looked at both, particularly some of those who have looked at US nuclear weapons policies, but also those like David Holloway and Pavel Podvig and Alex Wellerstein, who've also looked at Soviet nuclear weapons policies. I could have listed others. And similarly, studies of nuclear proliferation have really increased exponentially in the post-Cold War era, partly because of the greater availability of sources, not only about countries that built nuclear weapons, but those that chose not to. In some cases, very deliberately chose not to. In other cases, tried and came very close, like Iraq, but ultimately did not, because as is said in Casablanca, destiny took a hand. So the neutrality and non-alignment during the Cold War has been studied a great deal, especially in countries that were neutral during the Cold War. I've mentioned them here. Csaba and I have been involved in some of these projects that the Boltzmann Institute in Austria has sponsored, and also at the Stockholm University in Sweden. There was a volume that came out recently that includes a long series of essays about the Soviet Union and Cold War neutrality and non-alignment in Europe, that looks at the role of countries in their policies toward the Soviet Union and also Soviet policies toward them. So it covers Europe very extensively as it pertains to policies in connection with the Soviet Union, which US policies have been explored a great deal as well, but the Soviet policies hadn't been explored as much. That's what this volume was designed to do. There's been an enormous amount of research on the non-aligned movement, and those have led to articles that have appeared, important articles in the Journal of Cold War Studies and in many other journals. I wouldn't say there's yet a good book-length history of the non-aligned movement. There are a couple, but they are mostly based on materials that that don't really take full advantage of what has emerged. So that is still something that could emerge, and I know of at least 2 projects that are, or 2 PhD dissertations that are seeking to do that. Intelligence espionage in the Cold War has also been a topic of a great deal of research, partly again because the end of the Cold, it's a difficult topic inherently to deal with, but in the post-Cold War era it's become much more feasible to try to look at it because of the vast amount of material that has emerged, particularly CIA declassifications. Anyone who hasn't, I suspect that most people taking part in this conference are familiar with the CIA's electronic reading room. But if you aren't, you certainly should become so, because you will find tens of millions of pages of declassified documents posted there that you can download as PDF files. And these were mostly declassified in the post-Cold War era. There were some that were declassified earlier, but most of them were only recently declassified. By recently, I mean within the last 20 to 25 years. I've listed here some of the important collections of records that have emerged to allow for much greater investigation of espionage, Soviet espionage in particular. But there are also important resources that have emerged in East European countries on state security archival records. I just to single out one country here in Bulgaria, the commission that oversees the former state security records has posted online. It's around, I think at this point, around 55 collections of documents, and each one is they reproduce the documents and post them online as PDF files that can be downloaded. Each one is around 5,000 pages long. So you're talking about enormous collections of materials on all aspects of intelligence, both domestic intelligence activities, but also foreign activities, including Bulgaria, quite sensitive topics like Bulgaria's support for international terrorists during the Cold War, and arms supplies to various countries. Cultural dimensions of the Cold War is another topic that has been explored in great depth, and I'm not going to have time to go into this in any length, except to say that some of this looks at well-known programs like Radio Free Europe and other shortwave, the 40-odd countries that had shortwave radio broadcasts, the book distribution program, exchange programs, and the like. But there's also been very rich scholarship done on other cultural influences that weren't connected at all with governments, like the emergence of rock music or literature or films. Again, I don't have time to go into that, but it's a topic that I find extremely interesting in the way it's been developed in the post-Cold War period. So let me end then just by saying a quick word about a topic that I was discussing earlier, which has to do with notions of a global Cold War and how to think about this. This really was something, I mean, it's not a new issue. It was discussed during the Cold War itself. But still, in the post-Cold War world, it's become much more feasible to think about this. Tony Smith published an article in the October 2000 issue of Diplomatic History called New Bottles for New Wine, a paracentric framework for the study of the Cold War. And the idea was to try to think about the Cold War, not only to make use of the new sources that were emerging, but also to try to think about the Cold War in a different way, to try to look at it paracentrically, as he called it, from the periphery, rather than simply to focus on the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, during the Cold War, scholars did actually look quite extensively at the periphery. In quite a few cases, actually wrote about it from that perspective. So it's not to say that this topic had been ignored previously. Nonetheless, it became, as I mentioned, more feasible to discuss it in the post-Cold War period. So our Odd Arning Westhead, a former colleague of mine now at Yale, who also was at the Norwegian Nobel Institute for quite a few years and then taught at LSE for about 15 years earlier. But he, and again, a very well-known figure in Cold War historiography, he published a book in 2005 called The Global Cold War, Third World Interventions in the Making of Our Times. This developed the notion of a global Cold War, which again is not an especially new concept, but the phrase has gotten used in a way that sometimes makes me uncomfortable. So let me just say, Arnie published a book more recently, a few years ago, called The Cold War World History. This gives us a different take on it. I think a more satisfying take, even though I would question some of the specific points in it. It gives it looks at basically the Cold War as the subtitle suggests, as competing conceptions of modernity. I think there was a lot more to the Cold War than that, but it does get to an important issue that Mel Leffler, among others, but many others have also explored. The thing I would still come back to, though, is that I prefer speaking about the global impact of the Cold War as opposed to a global Cold War. Again, the part of the reason for that is the Cold War began in Europe. It didn't begin in the periphery. The Cold War began in Europe. It ended in Europe. There was still, there's still parts of the world in which Cold War residue is very much visible on the Korean Peninsula, for example, or in US-Cuban relations, or in numerous other aspects. Nonetheless, the Cold War ended, and that's why to talk about a global Cold War implies that it had to end everywhere, and it didn't. It ended in Europe where it began. And similarly, East Asia is the other crucial arena here because it spread so quickly to East Asia with the outbreak. Well, first the Chinese communists seized power, and then the Korean War, and so that's why to look at those two regions to understand where the Cold War ended and where it didn't. Even in East Asia, it didn't completely end. As I mentioned, the Korean Peninsula, if you go to the Joint Security Area in the demilitarized zone, I was there a few years ago, and it doesn't look much change from 1953. So even despite some of the rapprochement or attempted rapprochement between South Korea and North Korea, so the notion of a global Cold War, I would prefer instead to talk about the global impact of the Cold War. Moving away from Europe and East Asia is illuminating, but potentially creates confusion and diverts analysis to peripheral matters, both literally and figuratively. But if you instead talk about the global impact of the Cold War and look at it the way it affected almost every region of the world, including places where decolonization was not really part of it, it greatly affected the course of decolonization at almost every stage. But it was a separate process, but it still was greatly affected by the Cold War. But even in regions like Latin America, where decolonization had long preceded the Cold War, you can still see how the Cold War had profound effects on it. And that's why I would prefer to talk about the global impact of the Cold War. So with that, I apologize for going over, but we'll be glad to take questions in the time remaining. So let me end the sharing here if I can.